A gunslinger stumbles upon a young Apache girl hanging from a tree. A sign above her reads, "The white man does not forgive." What he uncovers next reveals a town's darkest secret. If you were in his boots, what would you do? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if this story got you thinking. The rope creaked with every gust that swept through the arid plains of New Mexico, each strained vibration forming a grim symphony that could chill even the toughest soul. Jacob Hierro McGannon reined in his horse beneath the gnarled branches of a lone oak tree, its broad shadow stretching across the dusty ground like a warning. His ice-blue eyes locked on the lifeless figure dangling from the thickest limb, a girl barely 12, her body swaying slightly with the wind. She wore a dress of soft buckskin, its fringe fluttering like a war banner beneath the punishing midday sun. A crude sign nailed into the bark of the tree, scrawled in dried blood, read in jagged letters, "The white man does not forgive." Jacob spat into the chalky earth the bitterness of his morning whiskey mingling with the acid of his rising bile. In his 38 years riding across the territories chasing bounties and facing down monsters in human skin, he'd seen hell in many forms. But this was different. The child's face was calm, almost peaceful, as though she'd finally found a rest life never allowed her. Her black braids framed her cheeks woven with beads and tiny feathers that shimmered dully under the merciless sun. No wounds, no blood, no bruises, just the noose and the message. Silent remnants of a justice twisted beyond recognition, corroding the soul of the West like rust on a blade. "Damn every last one of you," Jacob muttered under his breath, dismounting with slow, deliberate steps. His spurs clinked against the scattered stones each step, echoing like a gunshot in the unnatural stillness. Even the wind had hushed now, as if the land itself was holding its breath in horror. With trembling hands that had stayed steady through gunfights and bloodshed, he untied the rope. The girl's body was feather-light, as though the hatred that brought her here had consumed all that was physical. Jacob cradled her gently and carried her to his horse, wrapping her in his own worn trail blanket, the same one that had warmed him through countless desert nights beneath the stars. "I'll see you buried proper, little one," he whispered, even knowing she couldn't hear. "And I'll hunt the devils who did this if it's the last thing I do." His voice cracked, the edges of it splintering through the stoic armor he'd built over the years. For the first time in what felt like lifetimes, Jacob McGannon felt something break open in his chest. Not sorrow, not despair, but a white-hot fury, pure and sharp as flint. By the time he finished digging the grave beneath a sandstone outcrop that cast a sliver of shade, the sun had begun its slow descent. He didn't have a Bible, but he murmured the bits of prayer he could still recall from childhood days in Georgia before the war twisted him into the man he'd become. He fashioned a small cross out of dry branches and placed it at her head, tucking the beads and feathers he'd salvaged from her hair beside it. As he mounted up, Jacob didn't look back. He couldn't. But he branded every detail into his memory, the crooked angle of the tree, the direction of the wind, the dry, acrid scent of sagebrush, and death that lingered in the air. Someone would answer for this. And when they did, they'd learn what fear truly meant. The sign had warned that the white man doesn't forgive, but they were about to learn neither does Jacob McGannon. The nearest town lay 3 hours south Silver Creek. Jacob nudged his horse forward, vowing to reach it before nightfall. He had questions that needed answers, and if answers weren't freely given, he had bullets to bargain with. That Apache child deserved justice, and Jacob intended to give it to her no matter the cost. In the American West, a man was worth only as much as his word, and Jacob had just given his to the dead. Silver Creek was little more than a scatter of weather-worn buildings clinging to survival like ticks on a dying dog. It held about 200 souls, dreamers, drifters, and desperates who came chasing silver and found only dust and empty promises. Jacob rode down the main drag just as lamps began to glow in cabin windows, golden rectangles of light cutting through the gloom and pressing down on the earth, beaten flat by boots and hooves. At the heart of town stood the Golden Horseshoe Saloon, a raucous haven where miners drowned regrets and cowhands squandered wages on watered-down whiskey and worn-out women out. Jacob tied his horse to the hitching post and pushed through the swinging doors. The smell of tobacco and laudanum clung heavy in the dim air. The room fell to a hush, conversations trailing off as the regulars took in the stranger. They saw the way he stood like a man who'd stared into death and walked away. And they knew without a word, trouble had just ridden into Silver Creek. "Whiskey, the good kind," Jacob demanded, his voice flat but firm as he stepped up to the bar. Behind the counter stood a bald, thick-armed bartender with a scar slicing across his left cheek from ear to mouth. Without a word, the man nodded and poured a generous splash of amber liquid into a cloudy glass. It at least smelled like the real thing. Jacob downed half in one go, the burn sliding down his throat like molten iron. "You're new in town," came a voice from the far end of the bar. Jacob turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting a small man dressed in black with beady eyes and a smile that never made it past his teeth. A sheriff's badge glinted dully on the man's vest, tarnished and crooked, more of a mockery than a mark of the law. "Sheriff Connell Pike at your service. Jacob McGannon." Jacob replied, making no move to shake hands. "I came here with questions. On my way in, I passed an oak tree north of town, found a little Apache girl hanging from one of its branches. Every murmur in the saloon died instantly, as if someone had fired a gun into the air. Even the piano went quiet, the player's fingers frozen above the keys." Pike cleared his throat, smile turning brittle. Yes. Tragic, that one. But justice has its place, don't it? That little savage killed one of our town's most respected men." Judge Whitmore passed sentence. "Law of the territory." His words rolled off too smoothly, like a line rehearsed to death for the benefit of curious strangers. "Was there a trial?" Jacob asked as he finished his whiskey and gestured for another. "Any witnesses? Evidence lawyer? Maybe?" His tone was conversational, but the tension wound tight in his shoulders gave him away to anyone paying attention. Or was it one of those decisions made in the moment, the kind folks around here seem to favor? Pike swallowed hard, his eyes twitching around the room, searching for allies or an exit. "Listen, stranger," he said, trying to regain some composure. "I don't know what business you have with the law in Silver Creek, but I assure you everything was handled by the book. The girl murdered Henry Morrison, our town banker. Cold blood. 6 eyewitnesses." "How convenient," Jacob muttered. He noted how the poker tables had gone still, players watching now, with thinly veiled attention. A 12-year-old girl kills a grown man in cold blood. With what and where were her people? Did no one speak on her behalf? Each question struck like a hammer hitting nails into a coffin, and Pike felt every blow. "I've said enough," the sheriff snapped, squaring his small frame like it could make up for stature. "If you want more answers, take it up with Judge Whitmore tomorrow. He's got his office above the bank." Pike turned to leave, but Jacob's voice caught him mid-step, sharp as a lasso tightening. Sheriff Jacob said, without turning, his eyes locked on the fogged mirror behind the bar, watching the room through its reflection. "I hope you all sleep well tonight, because come morning this town's gonna change. And I don't mean the weather." The silence that followed was thick enough to slice through, heavy with unspoken threats and the scent of fear of gunpowder and blood. The Morrison Bank loomed at the corner of Silver Creek's main drag like a red brick tumor, dressed up in delusions of grandeur. Its leaded windows caught the early light, throwing off blinding reflections that hurt to look at. Jacob had spent the night in the stable behind the boarding house, restless and half-dreaming, haunted by a child's face. Not accusing, just asking why. Now, with bitter coffee burning in his empty gut, He headed toward the bank. The judge's office sat on the second floor, reachable by a weather-worn staircase that creaked with every step like it might give way. As Jacob climbed, he noticed dark stains on the planks, maybe old blood, maybe just years of chewed tobacco. The office door hung ajar, and from inside came the sound of someone drinking with the desperation of a man trying to drown more than thirst. Wes Whitmore. Jacob asked, nudging the door all the way open. The man slumped behind the desk had once been formidable, but now he looked more like the ghost of who he'd been. Wild gray hair, bloodshot eyes, and trembling hands clutched a whiskey bottle like it was the last thread holding him to earth. "Who's asking?" the judge slurred without looking up. "If it's legal, wait your turn. If it's money, I don't got it. If it's forgiveness, that ship sailed long ago." He took a long pull from the bottle, spilling some down his already stained vest. Jacob shut the door behind him and moved closer, brushing aside a stack of court papers before sitting on the edge of the desk. "I came to talk about the Apache girl you sentenced to die last week," he said. "I want to know why a 12-year-old had to swing for something she likely didn't even understand." His voice was quiet but carried the weight of steel beneath it. Whitmore finally looked up, squinting to bring Jacob into focus. "Ah," he muttered. "Another bleeding heart." He laughed dry and sharp like glass cracking. "You know how many of you good Samaritans have come through 3, all asking the same damn thing, all wanting justice for that little savage? Where were they when Henry Morrison lay bleeding out on the floor of his own bank? Where were they when his wife walked in and found his body?" Jacob's voice cut through the stale air like a knife, his hand resting loosely on the grip of his Colt. "Tell me what really happened. No embellishments, no lies, just the truth." Whitmore studied the stranger's face, something in it making him sit a little straighter, pushing the whiskey bottle aside like its comfort had suddenly soured. The girl. Her name was Anya, according to the Apache interpreter we brought in. He began, voice more sober now. She walked into the bank one Tuesday morning covered in blood, clutching a knife. Morrison was dead, sprawled out cold on the floor. It looked pretty damn cut and dry. He paused, eyes drifting to the dusty light bleeding through the grimy window. "Looked that way," Jacob echoed. Or was that just how it was supposed to look? The question hung in the room like gun smoke, hot, dangerous, impossible to ignore. Whitmore shifted in his chair, the leather groaning beneath him. His fingers tapped a nervous rhythm across a desk cluttered with ink stains and dried-out emotion. "Listen here, mister." The judge muttered, his voice falling into a whisper so low it might have been meant for ghosts. "This town, it has certain truths a man learns not to speak aloud if he wants to wake up the next day. Henry Morrison wasn't the saint folks make him out to be. He had urges, dark ones, weaknesses for young girls, the kind who wouldn't be believed, the kind no one would bother defending. His words dropped like stones into a deep black well, each one rippling with dread. Jacob felt the chill rise in his spine. "You're telling me she fought him off?" He said, the image of Anya's lifeless body swaying from the oak, now grotesque in ways that stole his breath. What he'd seen hadn't been justice. It had been the burial of a deeper sin, the execution of a child to protect the legacy of a predator. "I'm not saying anything," Whitmore mumbled, snatching the bottle again, fingers shaking around its neck. "I'm just drinking myself blind so I can forget I ever sat a bench, ever believed justice meant something, ever thought doing the right thing would matter." He drank long and deep like he hoped to drown in it. "But if you're looking for the real devils, Mr. McGannon, you won't have to go far. Just follow the trail of money and power. It always ends in the same damned place." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft jingle of Jacob rising to his feet, his spurs whispering across the floor like funeral bells. "Thanks for your honesty, Judge," he said, stepping toward the door. "That's more than I expected from a town choking on its own cowardice and lies." He paused at the threshold, not bothering to look back. If I were you, I'd sober up just enough to leave Silver Creek before nightfall. Things are about to get real ugly. Henry Morrison's home rose like a whitewashed monument to greed at the end of the street, 3 stories tall, painted and polished like a wedding cake dropped into a graveyard. Its grandeur clashed viciously with the adobe shacks of the miners and cowhands around it. From the shadow of an old collapsed feed store, Jacob studied the details, the always drawn curtains, the too-perfect garden that seemed out of place in a town where water cost more than liquor, and the 2 armed men quietly stationed near the rear porch. Mrs. Morrison appeared on the front steps, like a black widow, crawling from her web, dressed in heavy mourning that couldn't quite hide the curves of a still youthful figure. Even at a distance, Jacob could see the shimmer of glass diamonds on her pale neck, and the tears she wore were no more real than the stones. "Ma'am," Jacob said, stepping from the shadows and removing his hat with a politeness that didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry to intrude during your grief, but I have a few questions about what happened to your husband." She gasped dramatically, one hand flying to her chest in the kind of practiced gesture she'd probably repeated for every condolence visitor. "Oh, we haven't been properly introduced," she trilled, in a voice high and fluttering in all the wrong places. "I'm Constance Morrison, and I'm afraid I'm not receiving guests at this painful time." But her eyes sized him up like a merchant inspecting goods, calculating his worth and danger in a single measured glance. Jacob introduced himself, watching her closely. The name meant nothing to her powdered face. "I came asking about the Apache girl, the one they hanged for your husband's death. From what I've seen, that story's got more holes than a mining pan." His words struck like a spark tossed into dry hay. Constance flared. "That filthy little savage," she shrieked, the widow's mask slipping like cheap paint in the rain. "She murdered my poor Henry in cold blood. No reason, no provocation. She was a beast just like the rest of her kind." Her voice rose into a wild pitch, loud enough to draw curtains aside and noses to windows. Jacob watched the outburst with a veteran's calm. He'd seen it before in the guilty, that frantic need to convince, that hatred aimed not at the killer, but the victim. "Strange response for a grieving wife," he murmured. "Almost seems like you hated the girl more than you ever loved your husband." "How dare you!" Constance shrieked. But now there was real fear in her eyes. "Guards! Guards!" The 2 hired men materialized instantly as if they'd been waiting for the cue. Both were the kind of muscle bred in violence, faces carved by fights they'd won, and lost eyes like winter ice, cold and indifferent. Killers for hire, the sort who sleep soundly after a bloody day's work. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Morrison?" asked the taller of the 2, a scar shaped like a cross etched into his right cheek. His fingers rested casually but not idly on the butt of his revolver, the posture of a man for whom drawing and firing was second nature. His partner, stockier and broader, moved silently to cut Jacob off from behind. "This man is harassing me," Constance sobbed, the tears flowing now with a conviction she hadn't summoned once before. "He's saying the most vile things about my late husband, accusing him of things, implying he deserved what happened to him." Her performance was convincing, no question, but Jacob had seen tighter acts in the San Francisco playhouses. "Sir," the scarred man said, stepping forward with an unmistakable warning in his tone, "I think it's time you moved along. Mrs. Morrison's been through more than enough without outsiders poking at open wounds." There was authority in his voice. Real, practiced authority, the kind earned not from office, but from years of making people disappear. Jacob's smile was slow dry and nowhere near his eyes. "You're right, gentlemen. I believe I've heard all I needed to." He turned toward Constance and dipped his head in mock politeness. "My apologies for the disturbance, ma'am, though something tells me it's not your husband's memory that keeps you up at night, but the ghost of that little girl who never got to grow up." The words struck like slaps. Constance went sheet white, her hands clutching the porch rail as they visibly trembled. "Go," she whispered, her voice thin as a crack in glass.
Go now, before it's too late."
There was honesty in her tone, real this time, the first trace of it since they'd started talking. Jacob walked away at an unhurried pace, fully aware of the guard's eyes drilling into his back until he turned the corner. He had what he came for. Morrison had been a predator, his wife knew it, and the town was crawling with dangerous men eager to keep that truth buried. But they'd made one fatal mistake the day they strung up Anya. They made it personal, and Jacob McGannon had a debt to settle with a dead child. The cantina. The thirsty coyote reeked of old vomit piss and broken promises. The scent had haunted the place since the day it opened 5 years earlier, on the seedier side of Silver Creek. Jacob pushed past the burlap curtains, pretending to be a door, stepping into a room where sunlight dared not enter, and every patron drank to forget sins that followed them like starving hounds. Behind the bar, Miguel Santamaria looked up with the weary caution of a man who'd seen every shade of trouble stumble through that doorway. Wiry and compact with prematurely graying hair and hands that trembled slightly when they weren't busy pouring questionable liquor into even more questionable glasses. "Whiskey," Jacob said, tossing a silver coin onto the stained bar. "And maybe a little information if it's for sale." Miguel poured the drink into a glass that had seen better centuries, his movements precise yet delicate, like someone handling dynamite instead of booze. "Depends on what kind of information you're looking for, friend," Miguel said, his Spanish accent softened by years of living around cowboys and railroad men. "Some things cost more than money. Some things cost skin." His eyes flicked nervously toward the far corner where 2 hooded figures drank in wordless silence. Jacob followed his glance and smiled grimly. "Tell me about Henry Morrison," he said, leaning closer. "Not the official fairy tale. I want to know who he really was, what he did when he thought nobody was watching." Miguel's hands began to tremble harder, a sheen of sweat already forming on his creased forehead. "Mr. Morrison was a businessman." He began picking his words like he was picking his way across a minefield. "He had interests, the bank of course, but also other dealings, quiet dealings." His voice dropped to a hush, forcing Jacob to lean in further. "What kind of dealings?" Jacob pressed, sliding another coin across the damp wood. "And don't tell me he was smuggling bootleg whiskey. Hell, every banker out here does that." His tone was light, but his eyes were steel, and Miguel swallowed hard under the weight of them. He glanced around quickly before leaning in. "Girls," he whispered. The word fell between them like a stone into a still pond. "Young girls. He bought them from smugglers from desperate families. Sometimes he just took them from the reservations during raids." His hands now shook so violently, he had to set the bottle down to keep from dropping it. Jacob's blood turned cold in his veins. "And what did he do with them?" he asked, though he already knew. He saw it written in Miguel's haunted stare in the way the man seemed to be shrinking inward as if trying to vanish. "God help us," Miguel murmured. "No one did anything. No one said a word." Jacob asked, the fury in his chest rising like floodwater. Miguel scoffed bitterly. "Who would speak up? Morrison owned the bank. Half this town was drowning in debt to him. Sheriff Pike owed him his badge. Judge Whitmore owed his seat to Morrison's patronage. Those who knew the truth were bought off and those who didn't. Well, they preferred the safety of ignorance." Miguel poured himself a shot of his own whiskey and downed it in one hard swallow. "And the Apache girl, Anya?" Jacob asked, though the pieces had already begun snapping together in his mind. A defenseless child, a predator drunk on power, and one desperate act of resistance that ended in tragedy for both. Miguel closed his eyes as though he could shut out the images that haunted his conscience. "They brought her in about a month ago during Captain Forsyth's last raid on the Mezcaleros. She was just one of many they rounded up, but Morrison singled her out. Said Indian girls were more obedient." The word came out like poison, leaving a bitter taste that not even a barrel of whiskey could wash away. But she wasn't obedient. Jacob said more as a declaration than a question. A fierce smile touched his lips, half pride, half sorrow. The little warrior had fought back. For the first time since he'd seen her swinging from that cursed tree, he felt something akin to reverence for the dead girl. She had resisted. She had struck back. She had paid for it with the last shred of her stolen innocence. When they found Morrison, Miguel's voice dropped to a tremor barely more than a breath. Let's just say Anya made sure he would never hurt another girl again. He paused, pain flickering behind his eyes. But none of it mattered. The town needed a scapegoat, and a dead Indian girl doesn't speak in court. His eyes brimmed with tears he refused to let fall. In the corner of the bar, the hooded figures had crept closer without a sound, and Jacob could feel their stares like knives brushing against his spine. Miguel, he said softly, you might want to shut down early tonight, and maybe find a reason to leave town for a while. Things are going to get real dangerous around here. Miguel nodded, understanding the warning buried in the stranger's voice. Captain Theodore Forsyth lived in a neat little army cottage on the edge of Silver Creek, tidy, squared off, and coldly symmetrical, just like the man himself. Jacob found him in the backyard garden, meticulously cleaning a Spencer rifle as if it were some kind of sacred rite, every motion, deliberate, honed by repetition. He was a wiry man in his 40s, eyes gray and hard as flint with a scar slicing across his forehead. A battlefield souvenir long since healed, but never forgotten. Captain Forsyth, Jacob called as he approached, hands clearly visible and movement slow the way one walks around nervous men with weapons. Mind if I ask about your last raid against the Mezcaleros? I'm particularly interested in the cargo you brought back. Forsyth looked up from his weapon, coolly assessing Jacob with a soldier's detachment. And who exactly are you? He asked, never stopping the rhythm of his rifle cleaning, though every muscle in his body seemed ready for a different kind of action. If you're another reporter from Denver sniffing around for some military scandal, I'll save you the trouble. Go home. His voice had the sharp edge of command used to being obeyed without hesitation. Jacob McGannon, bounty hunter. Jacob replied, sitting down on a weathered log without waiting for permission. And I'm not here about military tactics, Captain. I'm here about a girl you delivered to a monster, and who was later hanged for having the courage to fight back. The words hit Forsyth like buckshot, and for the first time, the rifle went still in his hands. Silence settled between them like early fog, dense, heavy, and crawling with unsaid things. Forsyth laid the rifle across his lap. His fingers remained motionless, but tension pulsed beneath the stillness. I don't know what you're talking about, he said at last, though the conviction had drained from his voice. It sounded hollow, like a lie whispered inside an empty tomb. Those raids are classified military operations. That's bullshit! Jacob snapped, his patience now thin as desert dust. You handed over Anya, a 12-year-old Apache girl, to Henry Morrison like she was livestock, and I found her swinging from a tree with a sign nailed beside her, "The white man does not forgive." His eyes bored into Forsyth's like steel blades. The captain stood up abruptly and walked to the fence that enclosed his yard. His shoulders quivered slightly like a man wrestling demons that wouldn't stay buried. You don't understand how things work around here, he murmured, barely audible over the pine wind rustling through the trees. Then explain it to me, Jacob said, rising and stepping closer. Explain how a soldier sworn to protect the innocent justifies handing a child over to a predator. Explain how that serves your country or your honor. Each word cracked like a whip, stripping away the armor of justification and exposing the rot beneath. Honor! Forsyth exploded, whirling around with eyes that had seen too much and survived even worse. What the hell do you know about honor? Ever watched a town starve to death because the bank wouldn't extend credit? Ever see whole families lose their land because they couldn't pay their loans? His voice splintered, years of buried guilt erupting like infection from an unclean wound. Morrison owned this town, the water, the land,
The damn air we breathed. He didn't ask for favors, he demanded them dressed up as kindness. You think I had a choice? He began pacing, shoulders taut, words unraveling with every step. He controlled Sheriff Pike. He controlled Whitmore. He controlled me. When he asked for the girl, it wasn't a request. He stopped in front of Jacob, eyes glassy with tears that refused to fall. You think I didn't know what he'd do to her? You think I don't die a little more every night remembering it? But you handed her over anyway, Jacob said coldly, his voice like the blade of justice. Knowing, and when she found the strength to kill the man who violated her, you let them hang her for it. You stood by and called it justice. Forsyth collapsed back onto the log, his face crumbling into his hands. He said nothing more. There was nothing left to say. God forgive me. Forsyth sobbed, his body convulsing with guilt and shame. It wasn't just Anya. There were others, 6 in total over the past 2 years. Some were sold to brothels in distant towns. The rest he choked, unable to finish. The others just disappeared into Morrison's basement and were never seen again. 6. Jacob's voice was barely more than a breath, a horrified whisper. The weight of the revelation hit him like a gut punch. This wasn't a single act of evil. This was a machine, a methodical, calculated operation that had devoured young lives for years, while those in power either looked away or played their part. No one tried to stop it. No one said anything. Lieutenant Kowalski tried. Forsyth admitted, his tear-streaked face lifting to meet Jacob's. A year ago, he threatened to report everything to Fort Union. 3 days later, they found him out in the desert, torn apart, they said, by Apaches. But there weren't any Apache within 50 miles. His voice dropped, each word falling like blood on scorched dirt, each one a grim echo of the conspiracy's depth. Jacob felt his footing crumble beneath him. What had started as a search for justice for one girl had morphed into something far darker. Silver Creek wasn't just hiding a secret, it was the secret. A town fueled by horror, feeding on its most vulnerable, while the men meant to protect them stood by in silence, or worse, profited from it. There's more, Forsyth rasped, as though the words scorched his throat. Morrison wasn't working alone. There's a network, other towns, other businessmen. We shipped girls as far as California. Orders came from as far east as Chicago. It was a business McGannon, a thriving one built on the flesh and blood of children. His eyes locked onto Jacob's, searching for mercy, or maybe some sliver of understanding, but finding neither. Night had blanketed Silver Creek in silence, but Jacob McGannon couldn't sleep. He paced his small room in the boarding house like a caged lion, each step pounding with fury that burned in his chest like wildfire. Forsyth's confession had ripped the veil off a nightmare, each new revelation making Anya's execution more grotesque, more unforgivable. 6 girls, maybe more. Bought, beaten, raped, and erased. And Anya, that brave, fierce little warrior, had been the only one to fight back. The only one to make a monster bleed. And for her courage, for her raw and sacred justice, they'd hanged her like a criminal. A knocklight but firm interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Jacob's Colt was in his hand before the second tap, drawn with practiced ease. He moved toward the door in silence. "Who is it?" he asked softly, keeping the weapon low but ready, angled out of view of any eyes that might be peering through the cracks of the hallway. "It's Miguel Santamaria," came the whisper through the splintered wood. "I have something you need to hear, but not here, it's too dangerous." There was a tremble in his voice, fear laced with something harder. Jacob holstered the pistol and opened the door. Miguel stood in the hallway, pale as death and sweating despite the chill. His eyes darted left and right like he expected killers to leap from the shadows. "There's a place," he murmured. "Old abandoned mine just north of town. No one goes near it. Meet me there in an hour." Without waiting for a reply, he vanished down the corridor like a ghost slipping between the cracks of the world.
Jacob waited exactly 60 minutes before slipping out the back window of his room, careful to avoid the front entrance where Morrison's men kept watch. The mine once called Lost Hope had been the dream of some long-forgotten speculator who found only barren stone and growing debts. Now it was a hole in the earth whispered about in town lore, a place haunted by dead miners and regrets. Miguel was already there, standing near the entrance, hands shaking so badly he could barely keep his cigarette between his lips. "Thanks for coming," he said, crushing the stub under his boot. "After you left earlier, they came for me. Morrison's thugs. Told me if I didn't keep quiet, I'd end up like Lieutenant Kowalski." "What did you tell them?" Jacob asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning Miguel's face beneath the moonlight. There was something new in the barkeep's expression tonight. Resolve. Not the tremble of a frightened man, but the stillness of one who'd made a final decision. "I told them I didn't know what they were talking about," Miguel said with a bitter smile. "But truth is, I know a hell of a lot more than I shared earlier. Enough to tear this entire rotten thing to the ground if it gets into the right hands." From inside his coat, he pulled a weathered envelope creased, yellowed, and stained with what looked like dried blood. This belonged to Morrison. "I stole it the night he died, before the sheriff arrived." Jacob took the envelope with care, feeling the unmistakable heft of truth inside. "What is it?" he asked, though a part of him already knew. It was evidence. Proof. The kind that didn't lie. The kind that could pull the darkness of Silver Creek into the blinding light of day. "Correspondence," Miguel said, his voice gaining strength with every word. "Letters from men like Morrison scattered across towns from here to California. Purchase orders, price lists, names of clients, everything a federal prosecutor would need to tear this whole damn network apart." His eyes burned with a fierce light. "My little sister disappeared 2 years ago. Now I know why." The confession hit Jacob like a hammer to the ribs. Suddenly, everything made sense, the change in Miguel, the fire in his voice, the reason a man who'd stayed silent for years was now ready to risk his life. This wasn't just courage. It was vengeance. It was the kind of pain that only comes from loving someone who vanished into the dark and never came back, just like what Jacob felt for Anya. "There's more," Miguel added, pulling a second item from inside his coat. It was a beaded Apache necklace, small, fragile, clearly meant for a child. "I found this in Morrison's bedroom, with the rest of his trophies." The word came out like venom. "I think it belonged to Anya." Jacob took the necklace, and for the first time in years, his hands trembled. It was beautiful. Handmade with love and precision, probably crafted by Anya's mother. Each bead had been carefully chosen, each pattern woven with meaning only the dead now remembered. It was all that remained of a life stolen, a spirit extinguished, a justice never served. "Miguel," Jacob finally said, his voice thick with barely contained emotion. "This changes everything. With this, we can bring those bastards into a real courtroom, not the bought and paid for halls of Silver Creek." He tucked both the letters and the necklace into his coat, feeling their weight like a sacred burden. "No," Miguel said, shaking his head. "There's no time for courts. Morrison's men already suspect I took something. Tomorrow, they'll search my cantina, my home, everything. And when they don't find what they're looking for..." He drew a finger across his throat. "Besides what court, every judge within 100 miles is either bought or scared stiff." Jacob knew he was right. The rot went too deep. Too many powerful men with too much to lose. The law here was a business, and justice only came to those who could afford it. But there was another kind of justice. One older, one truer. "Then we'll do this the old way," Jacob said, his voice cold and sharp as forged steel, the voice of a man who had hunted evil across the territory and learned how to end it. "At sunrise it begins, but you're leaving Silver Creek tonight. Take your money, take whatever you can carry, and go. When I'm done, this town's gonna burn." Miguel nodded solemnly, understanding what was coming. "God bless you, Jacob McGannon," he murmured,
gripping the bounty hunter's hand tightly. "And may Anya rest in peace knowing someone fought for her." Then he disappeared into the dark, leaving Jacob alone with the truth, the rage, and the reckoning that would soon sweep through Silver Creek. Dawn broke over the town like a wound staining the sky with red and gold as the sun struggled to rise through a veil of mist. Jacob McGannon had already been awake for hours, preparing with ritualistic, calm-loading weapons, with the patience of a man who didn't fear violence. He planned it. His twin Colt .45s sat in oiled holsters. His Winchester rifle was locked and loaded, and he carried enough ammunition to arm a platoon. Today wasn't just about precision and speed. It was about sending a message that would echo far beyond this cursed town. First stop, Sheriff Pike's home, a sun-bleached adobe shack that looked like it had been built by someone with more ego than skill. Jacob didn't knock. He kicked the door open hinges, screaming like the dead, as the splintered wood slammed against the wall inside. Pike was in bed with a woman who was very much not his wife. Both of them were naked and startled as helpless as newborns. "Morning, Sheriff," Jacob said pleasantly, as if they were exchanging small talk on the street instead of having a rifle pointed between them. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything too meaningful, though considering your track record with corruption and child trafficking, I doubt anything you do qualifies as important." Pike lunged for the revolver on his nightstand, but the sound of Jacob's rifle cocking froze him in place. "McGannon," he rasped, voice ragged from last night's whiskey. "What the hell do you think you're doing? This is trespassing armed assault." His voice trailed off when he saw Jacob's expression. "This," Jacob said, his tone frigid, "is justice, something you clearly forgot how to deliver. Get up, get dressed. We're going for a walk, and you're going to tell the whole town exactly what kind of man Henry Morrison really was and what happened to those 6 girls." The woman on the bed began sobbing, clutching a stained sheet to her chest. "You're insane," Pike muttered, fumbling with his clothes, hands shaking. "No one's gonna believe some stranger's accusations. Morrison was respected in this town. He was a pillar of the damn community." But the words were empty even to him, lines from a script that had stopped making sense. Jacob smiled, a slow, cold thing that could freeze blood. "Oh, they'll believe me, Sheriff. I've got proof." He pulled Morrison's envelope from inside his coat, holding it up with quiet finality. Letters, details, the whole damn operation. Names, dates, prices, transport routes, everything a federal agent would need to tear this entire filthy empire to the ground. Pike's eyes widened, filling with dawning horror and cold, merciless realization. 15 minutes later, Sheriff Pike was marching down Silver Creek's main street, with his hands tied behind his back, and Jacob McGannon following close behind, rifle aimed squarely at his spine. Early risers paused mid-step, drawn by the sight, whispering among themselves in tones of confusion, alarm, and growing dread. This wasn't the kind of spectacle folks expected on a Tuesday morning. "People of Silver Creek," Jacob's voice thundered down the dusty road, echoing off the buildings with the clarity of a town bell. "Your sheriff has something he needs to tell you about your beloved Mr. Morrison and the real reason an Apache child had to die." Pike clenched his jaw, lips tight against the truth, but the cold pressure of the rifle barrel in his ribs urged him otherwise. "Henry Morrison." Pike began, voice cracking like dry timber. "He wasn't who you thought he was. He was a trafficker. He bought girls, young girls, used them, sold them, or worse." His words faltered, too vile to speak aloud, too true to deny. A wave of shock rippled through the gathering crowd. Some women covered their mouths, eyes brimming. Some men shook their heads slowly as if denial could still shield them from the truth. But others, those who had noticed things, suspected things, yet chosen, silence now stared at the ground faces stained with shame. "Keep going," Jacob ordered, pressing the barrel in deeper. "Tell them about Anya. Tell them how a 12-year-old girl had the courage you never did. Tell them how she did what you should have done years ago." His voice rang with an authority beyond law, an authority that turned the dusty square into a makeshift courthouse with truth as judge and guilt as jury. The Apache girl Pike choked out tears cutting trails through the grime on his face. She killed Morrison when he tried to, she defended herself. It was self-defense, not murder. But we needed a scapegoat. Someone who couldn't speak, someone who wouldn't be missed. The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jacob felt a cold satisfaction coil in his chest. The lie had been shattered. The veil had fallen. But truth without action meant nothing. It hadn't saved Anya. It hadn't saved the others. Words alone didn't stop monsters. It was time for Silver Creek to pay its debt. Under the merciless blaze of midday sun, Jacob McGannon made his way toward the Morrison estate one final time. He carried with him not just the iron of his weapons, but the weight of a justice older and truer than any law inked by cowards. The crowd followed at a cautious distance, murmuring like witnesses to a public hanging, and in some ways, that's exactly what it was. Constance Morrison waited on the porch, flanked by her 2 bodyguards. But something in her had shifted. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by the crumbling of her carefully constructed world. Her hands trembled as they gripped the porch railing, knuckles white beneath translucent skin. "Mrs. Morrison," Jacob said, stopping at the bottom step, "you and I have unfinished business. I believe it's time we discuss what you knew about your husband's activities and your role in covering them up." His voice was calm, almost polite, but carried the weight of finality. The guards exchanged nervous glances. "I don't know what you're talking about," Constance replied, though her voice no longer held that fierce defiance. It was barely a whisper, the last breath of a woman who had lived too long in rot and silence. "My husband was a respected businessman. Your husband was a monster," Jacob interrupted, stepping up the stairs one by one. "And you knew it. Hell, you helped him. You lived off his blood-soaked money, kept his house turned your head while he destroyed lives. And when a brave little girl finally gave him what he deserved, you helped lynch her to protect his legacy." Each word landed like a nail hammered into the coffin of her excuses. The guards stepped forward, hands drifting toward their guns, but Jacob was faster. His Colts appeared in a blink, barrels leveled at both men's hearts before either could blink. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone still disarmingly pleasant, "might be a good time to reconsider your career choices. Guarding child killers doesn't seem to be a growth industry in these parts." The taller one, the one with the scar shaped like a cross, raised his hands slowly, his bravado melting like frost under fire. "We were just following orders," he muttered. "Morrison paid well. A man's gotta eat." His partner quickly followed suit, hands raised, eyes wide. "Orders to protect a business built on the suffering of children," Jacob said, voice steady, weapons unwavering. "Do you know what happened to the 6 girls Morrison bought over the last 2 years? Want me to describe the trophies we found in his bedroom?" Both men turned pale, exchanging a single look of growing horror. Constance collapsed into a chair on the porch, her composure crumbling like plaster on a condemned wall. All the polished charm, the practiced lies, the carefully maintained image, it was gone. Her voice came as a broken whisper, tears cutting streaks through the powder on her cheeks. "I couldn't stop him," she murmured. "I tried when he brought the first girl. But he told me if I ever spoke a word, he'd kill me. And then when I saw the money, the beautiful things I could buy," her voice shattered entirely. "So you chose silence," said Jacob, one of his Colts now aimed squarely at her forehead. "You chose jewelry and fine dresses over the lives of innocent children. You chose comfort over humanity." The crowd gathered at the foot of the steps murmured with revulsion and judgment. The air felt charged like the moment before a thunderclap. "Please," Constance sobbed. "I didn't know how to stop it." I was afraid. He was my husband. He had money power. What could I possibly do alone? Her pleas sounded hollow even to her own ears, the dying echoes of a woman who'd sold her soul piece by piece and now faced the final invoice. Jacob stared at her for a long, hard moment. In her face, he saw not just the accomplice who had helped hide unspeakable crimes, but the woman trapped in a world rigged against the weak where fear corrupted everything it touched. Slowly, he lowered his gun, but didn't holster it. "Mrs. Morrison," he said evenly, "you have one shot at redemption. Just one." He reached into his coat and pulled out Morrison's letters, holding them out toward her. "These documents list every accomplice your husband had, every trafficking route, every buyer, every name. You're going to write a full confession, in detail, everything you know. Then you're going to carry these papers to a federal prosecutor in Denver. You will testify against every man named in those pages." "What if I refuse?" Constance asked, though the answer was already written in Jacob's eyes. She had seen what he was capable of, understood the unflinching resolve that moved through him like cold fire. He wasn't the kind of man who issued idle threats. He was the reckoning that followed years of silence. Jacob's smile held no warmth. "Then you'll find out there's still room in the West for vigilante justice," he said, voice low and deadly. "And trust me, my kind of justice makes federal court look like a Sunday sermon." His words fell like a final verdict, irreversible, absolute. It took 3 hours. Each sentence of the confession came slow and painful, like pulling teeth from a soul reluctant to bleed. Constance wrote of the girls she saw brought into the house of those who vanished and never returned. She wrote about the men in dark suits who visited under the cover of night, about the hush money from cities as far as San Francisco and Chicago. She wrote about a network that stretched like a spider's web across half the country. When she was done, Jacob reviewed the confession carefully. It was everything he needed: names, dates, bank transfers, locations. Enough for federal agents to blow the operation wide open. Enough to bring down a dozen powerful men. Enough to shut down trafficking routes that had thrived for years. It was justice, pure, relentless, and long overdue. "Morrison's guards are gone," someone in the crowd called out. "Rode out before dawn, heading south." Jacob nodded. Not surprised. Men like that were born with survival instincts. They always knew when the ground beneath them was collapsing. "Mrs. Morrison," Jacob said at last, tucking the confession and letters into his coat, "you're leaving for Denver at first light. You'll deliver these to U.S. Attorney Thomas Hartwell. If you're not in his office within 5 days, or if anything happens to you on the way, copies of these documents will be sent to every newspaper between here and Washington." "Do you understand me?" Constance nodded faintly. All the defiance drained from her like air from a slashed tire. "What's going to happen to Silver Creek?" she asked softly. The question lingered in the warm air. Jacob looked over the faces of the townspeople, faces that had looked away for too long, that had lived beside evil and chosen silence. There was fear in their eyes now, and maybe, just maybe, something like shame. "Silver Creek will have to learn to live with the truth," he said, speaking not just to her, but to them all. "You'll learn that silence in the face of evil is its own kind of crime, and turning away from suffering makes you just as guilty as the one holding the knife." His voice carried like a sermon across the dusty square. Then he turned toward his horse, but paused and looked back at the crowd one final time. "Anya," he said, his voice rough with restrained emotion. Her name was Anya. She was 12 years old. She loved feathers and beads. Someone loved her enough to make her a necklace, one that I now carry. And when the time came when no one else would stand up, she did. He let the silence settle around her name. Remember her, and remember what it cost her to do the right thing. He swung up into the saddle and rode north toward the quiet patch of land where he'd laid the little warrior to rest. The wind whispered through the rolling hills outside Silver Creek,
as Jacob dismounted beside Anya's grave. There was no cross, no polished stone, just a small mound of carefully stacked rocks and a faded, beaded necklace hanging from a wooden stake driven into the earth. Jacob knelt beside it, removing his hat with reverence. "I did it, little one," he whispered. "I can't give back what they took from you, but I made sure they heard your name, made sure you won't be forgotten." From inside his coat, he pulled a single blue feather, the same one he'd found near the remains of the campsite where they discovered Anya, and placed it gently atop the stones. It wasn't just a tribute, it was a promise. No more silence, not while he still drew breath. Days later in Denver, U.S., Attorney Thomas Hartwell stared grimly at the thick case file Constance Morrison had laid before him. Each page detonated with names, dates, and transport routes, an empire of rot sprawling farther than he dared imagine. The woman who once graced charity galas in Silver Creek now trembled across from his desk, hollow-eyed, gaunt, and for the first time in years, honest. "This," Hartwell said at last, "is going to light half the state on fire, then let it burn." Constance murmured, her voice coarse but steady. "I'm done hiding behind ashes." Hartwell nodded and lifted the phone. "Get me the director of the U.S. Marshals Service and prep multiple federal warrants. It's going to be a long day." Back in Silver Creek, the news moved like wildfire. Raids swept through like cleansing storms, mass arrests, property seizures, men with powerful last names led away in cuffs through the streets of Denver, Santa Fe, and even Washington. One by one, trafficking routes fell. What had once felt untouchable now collapsed like a clay giant soaked to ruin. In town, storefronts slowly reopened. Some residents packed up and left, unable to face the weight of their own silence. Others stayed behind, determined to rebuild not just the walls, but the soul of the place. In the center square, a modest plaque was mounted in Anya's memory, and for all those whose voices injustice buried. May her courage guide us always. A year later, far away in the backcountry of Montana, a remote ranch stood beyond the reach of paved roads and easy questions. It had become a safe haven for orphaned children, for women who had escaped the grip of trafficking. There, among horses, quilts, and books, they stitched broken lives back together with calloused hands and brave hearts. The man who ran it had a quiet voice and eyes that had seen too much. No one used his full name. They just called him the Scarred Cowboy. No one asked about his past. But everyone knew when someone spoke the name Anya, he would stand, look toward the horizon, and listen as if he could hear her laughter carried on the wind. Because sometimes redemption doesn't come with a bullet or a gavel. Sometimes it's a daily choice made in silence, like planting seeds in scorched earth, trusting that one day something good will grow. Now that we've come to the end of Anya's story, I just want to take a moment to share how deeply this tale has touched me. Writing it was emotionally intense, but necessary. This isn't just a Western revenge story. It's a story about justice, about truth, and above all, about humanity. Anya was more than a character, she was a symbol, a voice for every innocent soul silenced by power, corruption, and fear. Her courage, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, is a reminder that sometimes the smallest among us are the bravest. She didn't get justice from the law, but she found it in someone who still remembered how to be human. Jacob didn't just avenge her. He chose to carry her memory to make sure her name would never be forgotten. This story taught me so much. It taught me that silence is never neutral. It can be as dangerous as the crime itself. It showed how evil thrives not just through the actions of bad people, but through the inaction of good ones. And it reminded me that redemption doesn't always come with a gun or a courtroom. Sometimes it's in planting seeds of change where everything seems lost. So now I'd love to hear from you. What did you feel while listening to Anya's journey? Did something about Jacob or the town of Silver Creek stick with you? Let me know in the comments below. Let's talk about what this story meant to you. And hey, if this story moved you, share it. Let Anya's name echo beyond this video, because the more we remember her,
the less likely we are to repeat the silence that killed her. Until next time, keep your heart brave and your stories true.